Welcome everyone to Infinite Story Realm. Here, we step into the shadows to unearth the most bone-chilling horror stories, haunting urban legends, and supernatural mysteries from the darkest corners of the world. Prepare yourself, because once you enter this realm, there is no turning back. And now, settle in and let us begin today's story. I returned home after my mother's funeral. While cleaning out my childhood house, I found glass jars containing her secrets. Each jar was marked with a date, like a memory preserved in time. Yesterday, the jar dated April 17, 2021, shattered. Inside was a gray, withered umbilical cord. Today, a new jar appeared on the kitchen counter, marked with my birthday. The drive to Millhaven took 4 hours. I had made this drive before many times when I was younger and still thought of this town as home. Back then, the road had felt welcoming. Familiar trees lining the highway, the same gas station at the same exit, the smell of pine and wet earth when I rolled down the window. But that was a long time ago. I had left Millhaven at 20 for a job in the city. Somewhere in the years that followed, the visits grew shorter and further apart until they stopped almost entirely. Now I was 29, and I was coming back for my mother's funeral. My mother, Kyra Marison, had been found by a postal worker who noticed the mail piling up. The official report said natural causes. Her heart, most likely. She had been 61 years old and had not seen a doctor in years. There was no one to say exactly when it happened, or give a more precise answer. The postal worker said the milk on the porch had gone 3 days sour. That was how they measured it. 3 days. I sat through the funeral in a gray dress I had bought the morning before, because I hadn't owned anything black. There were fewer people than I expected. A handful of neighbors. An old priest with white hair and kind eyes who shook my hand after and said my mother had been a good woman. I nodded and thanked him and did not cry, which surprised me. I thought I would cry. Instead, I felt only a strange hollow feeling behind my ribs, like a room that had been emptied of furniture. After the service, I drove to the house. It was a 2-story wooden house at the end of Carver Lane, set back from the road behind overgrown hedges. I remembered those hedges being neatly trimmed. Now they were tall and wild, blocking most of the front of the house from the street. The paint on the shutters was peeling. One of the gutters had come loose and hung at an angle from the roofline. The garden my mother had once been so proud of, roses mostly, and a little herb bed along the south wall was gone, replaced by weeds and long grass. I sat in the car for a moment before getting out. The key was where it had always been, under the ceramic frog by the front step. The frog was cracked now, its painted smile worn almost away. I picked up the key and unlocked the door. The smell hit me first. Not a bad smell exactly. A closed smell. The smell of a place that had been shut up for a long time. Stale air, and something underneath it, faintly sweet, like old fruit. I stepped inside and reached for the light switch. The bulb in the hallway flickered and then held. The house was not dirty. That was the first thing I noticed. I had half expected to find dishes piling in the sink and dust thick on every surface. But the house was clean. The floors had been swept. The kitchen counters were bare and wiped down. There were no dishes in the sink. What was strange was everything else. I found them as I began moving through the rooms. In the living room, pushed against the far wall, was a small wooden table. On it sat a set of alphabet blocks, the kind made for toddlers, arranged carefully in a row. Beside them was a picture book, bright cover, simple drawings of animals, and a small stuffed rabbit with one eye missing. I picked up the rabbit and turned it over in my hands. It was worn with handling, the fur rubbed soft in places. I set it back down. In the hallway, there was a blackboard on a stand, the kind used in old schoolrooms. Words had been written on it in chalk, careful large letters, the way you would write for someone learning to read. I stood in front of it and read, "My name is." Below it, written in a different hand, shakier and smaller, were 2 letters. unfinished, or maybe just simple. KY. I stared at this for a long moment. Then I moved on. There was a second blackboard in the back room. More of the same careful large letters. This is a bird. This is a tree. This is home. I told myself what I would keep telling myself for the rest of that first day. That neighborhood children must have come and played here. My mother had always been kind to children. Perhaps after she stopped going out, she had let the local kids come in to keep her company. It was an odd thing, but not an impossible thing. I kept cleaning. I found the first jar near the end of the afternoon, in the back of the kitchen cupboard behind a stack of old plates. It was a glass jar, medium-sized, the kind used for preserving fruit. The lid was sealed with wax around the rim and wrapped several times in black electrical tape. The tape extended down around the body of the jar. The contents inside were dark enough that the black tape almost didn't matter. I couldn't see anything through the glass. What caught my attention was a strip of white masking tape on the front of the jar. On it, written in my mother's handwriting, was a date. March 14th, 2011. I knew that date. I stood very still for a moment, holding the jar, feeling the coolness of the glass against my palms. March 14th, 2011 was the day my father died. I tried to open the jar. I worked my fingers under the tape, tried to twist the lid. It didn't give. I tried harder, wrapping the hem of my shirt around the lid for grip, and still it didn't move. Whatever seal my mother had put on it was firm and old and not interested in being broken. I set the jar on the kitchen counter and stood looking at it. After a moment, I went back to the cupboard. There were more, tucked in different corners of the cupboard, all identical in their wrapping, all sealed, all with dates written on the white masking tape. I lined them up on the counter and read through them. October 25th, 1996. My parents' wedding anniversary. They would have dinner at a nearby restaurant on this day every year, even after my father passed away. September 3rd, 2008. The day our dog, a fat golden retriever named Biscuit, had been hit by a car. I was 8. I still remembered my mother kneeling in the road, not caring about her clothes. June 2nd, 2000. My birthday, and one other I didn't know. April 17th, 2021. What happened on that day? I had no way to know. I had left home long before it. I stood in the kitchen until the light outside turned orange, and then I decided I was done for the day. I gathered all 4 jars and placed them in a cardboard box, which I set on the kitchen table. Then I locked the house, drove to the one motel in Millhaven, and tried to sleep. I came back the next morning with coffee and a box of things from the motel's sad continental breakfast. I unlocked the front door, stepped inside, and stopped. The box on the kitchen table was nowhere to be found. I crossed the kitchen in 3 steps and looked for it, as though the box had grown limbs and wandered off. But there was no such thing. The table was bare. Instead, I found the jars exactly where I had found them the day before, each one back in its original spot in the cupboard. I checked each one, counting. All 5 were there, exactly as I had first discovered them. And in the corner of the cupboard, in a space I was certain had been empty yesterday, there was a 6th jar. I took it out with hands that were not quite steady. The tape, the date, it was my mother's date of passing. The same date I had only learned 2 weeks ago when the call came. I put the jar down on the counter very carefully, as though it might break. Then I turned around, walked to the front door, and left. The house next door was a squat brick bungalow with a well-kept garden. I knocked, and a man in his 60s answered. I recognized him vaguely from the funeral. Dale, I thought. Dale Henshaw. Miss Marison, he said, and his face arranged itself into something careful and sympathetic. Can I help you? I told him about the jars. He listened without interrupting, which I appreciated. When I finished, he shook his head slowly. I don't know anything about any jars, he said. Never saw anything like that in her house. She didn't invite people in, really. Not in the last few years. That's what I wanted to ask you about, I said. What happened to her? She used to love being outside. The garden, the Saturday market. What changed? Dale leaned against his doorframe. He was quiet for a moment, thinking or deciding whether to say what he was thinking. 8 years ago, he said finally. Around 8 years ago, she just stopped coming out. We noticed because she'd always wave from the garden, stop to chat over the fence. Then one summer, she just didn't anymore. We thought she was ill at first. Dorothy, my wife, knocked a few times to check. Your mother would come to the door and say she was fine. She was just resting. She seemed healthy enough, but she stopped coming outside. But she did go out sometimes, I said. Didn't she? Something shifted in his expression. You've heard. The priest mentioned it. Dale nodded slowly. A few times a year, always at night, and I mean late at night. 2, 3 in the morning. You only knew because you'd get up for the bathroom, look out the window, and there she'd be, walking down the lane with her shopping bags. We saw her at the all-night grocery over on Temple Road. Edgar Prentice works the night shift there, and he mentioned it once. Said she'd come in maybe once every few months, very late, and she'd buy more groceries than you'd expect for one person. Milk mostly, a lot of milk, and vegetables, meat, and bread. That doesn't sound strange, I said. No, except for the other things. He shifted his weight. Edgar said she also bought children's books, flashcards, craft paper, the kind kids use in school, coloring books sometimes, jigsaw puzzles for children. He paused. She was 62 years old and buying infant formula. More than once. The morning felt suddenly colder than it had been. She never told anyone why? I asked. You couldn't ask her. The moment she ran into someone she knew, she'd go red in the face and all but run back home, like she'd been caught doing something. He looked at me steadily. I always thought she must have had someone living with her. Some relatives, maybe. But you would have known, wouldn't you? I said nothing. Go speak to Father Aldous, Dale said. He's the only one she seemed comfortable with. If anyone knows what was going on in that house, it's him. Father Aldous kept a small office behind the church, walls lined with books, 2 chairs facing a scratched wooden desk. He poured tea without asking and set it in front of me. Then he folded his hands and waited. I told him about the jars first, then about what the neighbor had said. He listened to all of it with the same expression, attentive, still, something in his eyes that was not quite surprise. The jars, he said when I finished. Yes, she mentioned them to me once years ago. She said they were what she held dearest, her exact words. She had asked me, some years before that, how a person could honor the big days of their life. Not birthdays exactly, more like turning points, moments that changed things. He lifted his tea. I told her what I tell most people. Keep a small object. A photograph, a letter, a pressed flower. Something that connects you to that moment when you hold it. And she followed suit. I said, it does seem so. And it seemed to bring her comfort. She never told me what she put inside them, and I never asked. People find their own ways to grieve. What do you think is in them? He was quiet for a moment. I think you'll find out when you're ready to know. I looked at my tea. The neighbor said she was buying baby formula, children's things. He thought she had someone living with her. Father Aldous was quiet for long enough that I looked up. A few years ago, he said carefully, she came to me with an unusual request. She asked me if I knew where she could obtain breast milk. I stared at him. I told her I didn't, of course. I asked why she needed it. She said it was for her pregnant daughter in the city. He set his cup down. I offered cow's milk, goat's milk as alternatives. She took my words before leaving. I don't have children, I said flatly. I've never been married. What? His eyes widened in shock. I didn't know that. We sat with that between us. She never explained herself? I asked. No. And I? He paused. I should have pressed harder. I told myself she was confused, perhaps. Getting older and confused. I told myself it wasn't my business. He looked at me over his folded hands. I am sorry, Kylan. I think I knew that something was not right, and I didn't ask the questions I should have asked. I drove back to the house. I found the box of latex gloves I had brought for cleaning and put them on. Then I collected all 5 jars from the cupboard and brought them to the kitchen table. I arranged them in order of date, oldest to newest, and sat down across from them. The oldest date, October 25th, 1996. My parents' anniversary, June 2nd, 2000. My birth, September 3rd, 2008. Biscuit, our dog, March 14th, 2011. My father. Then the date I didn't know, April 17th, 2021. 8 years ago. And last, my mother's own passing. 2 weeks ago. I tried prying open the jar from April 2021 first. Because 8 years ago was when Dale had said my mother stopped going outside. I wedged a knife under the lid, worked at the tape, tried twisting until my palms ached. The seal held. I tried the jar from my father's passing. Then the one from my birth. None of them gave. I started on April 2021 again, frustrated now, digging the knife in harder. My hands slipped. The jar hit the corner of the table and exploded against the floor. For a moment, I just stood there, glass around my feet, heart hammering. Then I looked down at what had been inside the jar. It was a length of tissue, I thought at first. Something pale and coiled and preserved, dark at the edges. Then I understood what I was looking at. An umbilical cord, perfectly preserved, somehow even after 8 years in a sealed jar. I pressed both hands over my mouth. My legs went soft and I had to grab the back of the chair. April 2021. 8 years ago. A birth. With hands that wouldn't stop shaking. I reached for the jar from March 2011 and drove the knife under its lid until the seal broke. Inside was a heart. Small and dark and very still, but unmistakable. I knew it was my father's because of the date, and because my mother had written his name on the inner surface of the tape. I found this when the broken pieces fell. I sat on the kitchen floor and breathed. Then, because I couldn't stop myself, because some part of me needed to see it all at once, I reached up to the table and knocked the jar from 2008 to the floor. Inside was a smaller heart. Biscuits. I sat surrounded by broken glass and what my mother had held dearest, and I thought about all of it. The priest's words. What I hold dearest. The alphabets on the blackboard. The stuffed rabbit with one eye. The formula. The children's books. The groceries bought at 3 in the morning. The portion too much for one person. The child that was not me. The child whose birth my mother had kept in a jar like a precious and terrible secret. I stood up slowly and looked at the last jar. My mother's passing. A brand new jar with a brand new date, placed there by someone while the house had stood locked and quiet. Then a thought arrived, quiet and cold and precise. I found that jar after I arrived, after I came home. So who put it there? I turned around. The kitchen doorway was dark. The hallway beyond it was dark. The house was still in the way that houses are still when they are listening rather than empty. Hello. My voice sounded very small. Nothing answered. I took a step toward the doorway and reached for the hallway light switch. My fingers found it and clicked it up. The hall filled with light. No one was there. I let out a long breath, slow and shaking. Then something struck me hard at the back of my head, and the light went away. Dale Henshaw was not a man who worried easily. He had lived on Carver Lane for 30 years and had seen enough of life to know that most things had simple explanations. That the best thing you could do for a neighbor was give them space and check in when it felt right. He had given Kylan Marison her space after the funeral. She was a grown woman, cleaning out her mother's house. That was private business. He hadn't wanted to hover, but 3 days had passed since he last saw her car in the driveway. He told himself it meant nothing. She could have driven back to the city, could have finished her work and left without stopping to say goodbye. They weren't close after all, just neighbors once removed through her late mother. There was no reason to think anything was wrong. He thought about the jars she had described, the way her face had looked when she told him about them. Not the face of a woman who was about to pack up and leave. On the morning of the third day, he crossed the lane and knocked on the front door of the Marison house. No answer. He knocked again, harder, waited. The curtains in the front window were still. He stepped back and looked up at the second floor. No movement. The ceramic frog by the step caught his eye. He stood looking at it for a moment, then lifted it. The spare key was still there. He told himself he would just check that everything was in order. The house was clean and quiet and empty. He went through the ground floor room by room, calling her name. The living room with its strange little table and alphabet blocks. The hallway with the blackboard. The back room. He climbed the stairs and checked each bedroom, the bathroom, an empty storage closet. He came back downstairs. In the kitchen, he stopped. On the counter, in the spot nearest the window, sat a single glass jar. It was sealed with black tape, the lid waxed shut. A strip of white masking tape ran across the front. On it, in handwriting he didn't recognize, smaller and less practiced than Kyra Marison's, though it had the same careful quality, was a date. 3 days ago. Dale stood looking at it for a long time. He reached out and picked it up, turned it in his hands. He could not see what was inside. He gripped the lid and tried to turn it. It didn't move. He tried harder. The lid held firm. Whatever was sealed inside that jar intended to stay sealed. He set it back on the counter. Then, because the date on the tape was 3 days ago, because Kylan Marison had been missing for 3 days, he took out his phone and called the police. They searched the house first. 2 officers went through every room while Dale stood in the front garden, watching the windows. They found the broken glass on the kitchen floor, the shattered remnants of several jars, dark stains that the lab would later spend a long time examining without firm conclusion. They found the remaining sealed jars on the table, which they bagged and tagged and photographed. They found Kylan's car still parked in the driveway, her handbag on the passenger seat, her phone face down on the floor mat. Her phone had a dead battery. When they charged it later, they found no calls made or received in the hours before she disappeared. No messages sent. Only a series of photographs taken that last afternoon. Photographs of the jars, lined up on the kitchen table in order. And one final photograph that was mostly dark and blurred, as though taken by accident. It showed only the edge of the kitchen doorway and part of the hallway beyond. They couldn't make out anything in the hallway. They widened the search to the street, then to the neighborhood, then to the surrounding roads. They knocked on every door on Carver Lane and the streets beyond it. Nobody had seen Kylan leave. Nobody had seen a car they didn't recognize. Nobody had heard anything, which was the thing that bothered the lead detective most. It was a quiet street and people noticed things. But the night Kylan Marison disappeared, no one on Carver Lane had noticed anything at all. Father Aldous was questioned. Dale was questioned. Edgar Prentice, the night shift worker from the grocery on Temple Road, was questioned. All of them said the same things in different orders. Kyra Marison had been a shut-in. She had bought strange things. Nobody had really known her in those last years. Nobody had been inside the house. The jar on the counter went to the lab with everything else. The lab could not open it at first. It took a specific tool and a good deal of effort. When they finally got it open, the lead detective stood over the examination table for a long moment without saying anything. Then she put her gloves on and stepped back and told the room to get the photographer. The report she wrote afterward was careful and precise and said very little beyond the facts. She was good at her job. She knew that a fact without an explanation was still a fact, and that sometimes explanations didn't come. The content of the jar was logged. The case file stayed open. Kylan Marison was never found.